Hello, and thank you for joining us on yet another episode of the PwC Leadership Exchange. We are recording this on the 9th of September in the afternoon in Dublin, so things may have changed by the time you get to eventually listen or watch to this webcast. I'm delighted to be joined today by Rohit Kumar, who's the PwC US National Tax Co-Leader for National Tax Policy. And I want to ask you a couple of questions about tax, and I want to link that to the election. But before I do, a little bit of background on you, because you did some stuff that would make all the political junkies who watch this very excited, including staffing for Mitch McConnell.
Yeah, so before I joined PwC in 2013, I spent about 15 years on Capitol Hill working for a bunch of different Senate Republicans. The senator that I worked the most recently for was Mitch McConnell, who was then now and still is today the Senate Republican leader. I did 7 years for him, 4 years doing all of his tax, trade, banking, financial services work, which is the same portfolio that I had for the two Republican leaders that preceded him. I did an 11-year stretch in the leader's office. But for the last 3 years, I was his deputy chief of staff. So I picked up a broader suite of policy issues. I did immigration policy, foreign policy, Iran, like all things that are going great. But just by happenstance, luck, bad luck, however you want to think about it, the 3-year period when I was his deputy chief of staff was the same 3-year period where every time there was a sort of fiscal policy crisis in the United States that needed to be resolved at the very last minute, right? Congress is nothing if not deadline driven, never turns its homework in early, often turns it in late. For those 3 years, every time there was one of these like big showdowns on fiscal policy, it was Senator McConnell and then Vice President Biden who were the two that got together to negotiate a resolution to the outstanding issues at the 11th and a half hour. And as is often the case when two principals are getting together to meet, they each bring one staff member to assist in the negotiation. So I kind of became the McConnell plus one, as if these were like weddings, forced weddings, to each of the Biden-McConnell negotiations. And actually, as a result of that, got to know then Vice President Biden, got to know him pretty well. We had a number, like tons and tons and tons of very close quarter interactions in rooms no larger than the one we're in right now, sometimes at his residence, sometimes in the Capitol, sometimes by phone. And actually, despite the fact that we were on the other side of the policy issues and negotiating fiercely on all the issues of the day, whether it was tax or spending policy or sometimes both, actually developed a pretty significant personal affection for him. He was an incredibly...
He's effective at reaching across the aisle.
He was incredibly decent to me in ways that were not required. Right? I worked for a member of the other party. I worked for a different part of government. He could have treated me poorly, and I would have never said anything to the public, or certainly Senator McConnell would never say anything to the public. But he went out of his way in ways that were obvious, that were intentional. And just one anecdote, and then we can get into it. But the very first interaction we had was by phone, and for some reason they couldn't find his chief of staff. How the vice president's chief of staff can't be located is a separate question. But Senator McConnell could always find me. The three of us are on the phone, and he's trying to ask a question, like a reasonably detailed tax, like how does this tax credit work, type question that would have been unusual for him to be asking Senator McConnell. He was clearly trying to direct it at me. But this was our first conversation. He didn't know my name, right? He just, there's no reason why he would know my name. And he was sort of fumbling around, trying to direct the question at me without knowing my name, and he finally just admits to it. He says, I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Can I just call you Mitch's guy? Right? I'm like, you're the Vice President of the United States. You can call me Mr. Poopy Pants. I'm going to answer your question because you're the Vice President, and my role is to help facilitate this transaction. The very next day we met in person. He marched over, saw me walk in with Senator McConnell, clearly knew who I was, marched over and said, how are you doing, Rohit? Right? He didn't, not only did he know my name, this is an unusual name. Right? He stuck the landing on the pronunciation. And I asked afterwards one of his staffers, I said, yesterday he didn't know my name and now he's speaking like a native. What happened in between? And they said he felt bad that he didn't know your name, and we had a little session on who are you and how to say your name, and then he made a point of coming over and said, I didn't know your name yesterday, and today I do.
I'm not going to get into it now, but on a different podcast, you outrageously name-drop a meeting in the Oval Office with Obama, Biden, Pelosi, Reid, Schumer, McConnell, a whole roll call of the kind of great...
Enough White House staff to sink a small ship. Yeah.
But let's get to the meat of it, right? So we are about 60 days out, roughly, from November 5th. And we are starting over the last week or two to see economic policy starting to get discussed and moving off personalities, right? So give us a quick kind of like pen picture of, given it's the 9th of September and things may change, but where are we at today in terms of what the two rival tax policies might look like?
Yeah, so there's areas of agreement and then some obviously areas of disagreement. Where they agree is that no sort of individual wage earner in the United States making less than $400,000 should experience the automatic tax increase that would otherwise happen come January 1, 2026, right? As a reminder, all of the individual tax cuts from the 2017 Act expire at the end of 2025. Yeah. And so if nothing happens, every wage earner in the United States experiences an automatic tax increase, and they should experience it relatively immediately. In that we have withholding for individual income taxes, and if the rates go up, the withholding goes up, and the last paycheck someone gets in December and the first paycheck they get in January will look quite different.
And just so we're clear for everyone listening, whoever's in government has to deal with that. Otherwise, it's an automatic.
It's automatic, right? These tax cuts just expire. Yeah. And so then it's just a ministerial task of the Internal Revenue Service saying, okay, with these higher rates, you have to withhold this much additional income as a tax liability from each paycheck that you send your employees. So the employers do the withholding, but they do it at the direction of the Internal Revenue Service. So we've got this automatic tax increase that happens. It's not the only thing that happens, it's the biggest piece of what happens. There are some other things that expire at the same time. Just to put it in context, all told, if the US government wanted to extend all the policies as they exist today, and not let anything change at the end of 2025, it would cost the federal government about $5.5 trillion of revenue over the ensuing decade. Congress budgets in 10-year windows, so we sort of think of these as 10-year numbers. Just to put that number in context, the federal government's going to collect a little bit north of $60 trillion over that same period of time, so it's not quite 10% of anticipated revenue collection, but this, to be clear, this is real money, even for the US government. This is real money. We sometimes talk about, this is only a couple $1 billion, and for regular people, that's a lot of money. For the US government, a couple $1 billion is like rounding error, kind of the change in the cushions kind of money. This is real money for the federal government. So Vice President Harris has largely adopted many of the Biden proposals, Biden official budget proposals, and then became campaign proposals, and she's adopted most but not all of them, which is to say, no one making less than $400,000 should be exposed to this automatic tax increase. She has proposed raising some of the corporate taxes, like raising the headline U.S. corporate rate from 21 to 28%.
That's a big move.
That's a big move. She's proposed there's an excise tax on stock buybacks. It's 1% today. She's proposed taking it up to 4%. So those are sort of like big broad strokes. Her proposals. The capital gains rate on the individual side, raising that from effectively 23.8, where it is today for taxpayers above a certain income threshold, all the way up to 33. So those are sort of her kind of key proposals. And then there's some tax relief targeted at lower and middle income families, but generally not corporate tax relief. That's not kind of where she's going. Former President Trump has said all of the expiring tax relief should just be extended.
Yeah, will be rolled over.
We'll roll over, just extend it all. Now, she has said no one less than $400,000. He has said everybody. Yeah. Just for the individual piece, I said the whole thing's $5.5 trillion, but the individual component is probably $4 trillion of that $5.5. Her let's protect everyone less than $400,000 is 2.5 of the 4 on the individual side. So a good chunk of what, in terms of revenue cost, is sort of pre-agreed to. Like the 2.5 is like sort of not automatic because it's Congress still has to do it, but they're not going to argue over that 400,000 and below. Somehow we have defined over the years in the United States that the middle class are those making less than $400,000 of income. Almost nothing could be further from the truth. The average family of 4 in the United States makes about $70,000. Yeah. So at $400,000, you are wealthy. Yeah. You may not feel wealthy based on your expenses and your cost of living, but you are, by any objective metric, a well-off, high-income earning family in the United States. So that 2.5 is they agree on. Those are the sort of, what I've talked about in terms of expiring tax provisions, those are like the must-do items. Like something has to happen or else you have this automatic tax increase, the public will react poorly to that, and there's at least a chance. I'm not an economist, I have an undergraduate economic degree, but nothing further. But I think, well, more importantly, I'm not an economist, but I know how politicians think about these things. I think they will come to believe that if they don't do something at the end of 2025, that there is a risk that if you take that much money out of the economy effectively overnight, that you risk triggering a recession.
But wasn't, and just I'm going back into history now, this was Trump's package of tax cuts. And if I remember right, the only reason it expires is because the Congressional Budget Office wouldn't let it in otherwise, right?
So it's a combination of things. Republicans had the House, the Senate, and the White House. And they were using a tool called budget reconciliation, which despite the term reconciliation is actually pretty partisan. In fact, it is a partisan tool used by one party when it controls all three levers, House, Senate, White House, to enact sort of fiscal policy changes without having to secure the support of the opposition party or the minority party. Typically in the United States Senate, anything of significance requires a supermajority, 60 votes, 3/5 of the chamber, and no party, with rare exception, no party has 60 votes in the Senate. But this is a way that, and both parties have used it over the years, with a simple majority vote to be able to enact fiscal policy changes. But it comes with a whole bunch of restrictions. So the penalty you pay, one of the penalties you pay anyway, for using this process and depriving the minority party of any input into the conversation, is that the bill that you're enacting cannot increase the federal budget deficit outside the budget window. So there are two components here. Can't increase the deficit, but only outside the budget window. I said earlier the budget window is typically 10 years. Congress can actually set the budget window. There's no reason, it could be 10, 20, 50, whatever they want to do, they can do. But historically it's been 10 years, and so 10 years it was. So to comply with this requirement and to avoid having to secure the support of Senate Democrats, what Republicans did in 2017 was to say, look, the corporate tax relief, that will be permanent. Right, because we can't expect businesses to reorient their structure and make big investment decisions if the corporate tax rate is going to bounce back up to 35, 8, 9 years from now. But the individual tax cuts, we will sunset those at the 8th year, leaving 2 years for any tail on the revenue loss to kind of peter out, so that all of the revenue loss is within that 10-year window. So this is a feature of the process by which these tax cuts were enacted. And actually, if there's one thing that people take away from this conversation, it is the process drives the policy far more than the policy drives the process.
Okay, so just a quick recap is on individual taxes, it depends on the south of 400, north of 400, but something's going to happen, right? And then on corporation tax, the Democrats have come out and said an increase, potentially up to 28%.
That's right.
It's a big move. Republicans are holding. Now, so this gets into, right, the election hasn't happened yet. Where we land on, for example, the corporate rate is entirely dependent upon what the voters decide in November. Actually, on November 5th, sort of misstates it. Early voting in the United States starts as early as next week, right, and continues, through Election Day, and even in some cases a couple days after if you're mailing in your ballot. But at some point, let's say by mid-November, we'll have a sense of, hopefully, who controls the Senate, who controls the White House, who controls the House of Representatives. But who's running the place in 2025 will have significant consequence for things like the corporate rate. So in a world where Democrats have run the table, right, Senate, House, White House, like the first 2 years of the Biden administration, then a significant corporate tax rate increase is certainly on the table. I don't know that it would go all the way to 28, because if Democrats are on the table, their best case scenario in the Senate is 50-50. Yes.
Right? Now, this will be if 50-50.
And they're defending more seats than the Republicans.
They're defending way more seats than Republicans. The Senate map is very Republican friendly in its orientation. And this is not gerrymandering. No one redrew law. These are states. We don't redraw the state borders every 10 years. This is just accident of history stuff. Democrats had very good cycles in 2012 when President Obama was getting reelected over Mitt Romney. and then a very good 2018 because Republicans had controlled Washington, D.C. For the 2 years prior. And always, when one party has total control, after those 2 years, the pendulum swings back and the public says, oh, we don't actually like one party having total control. And so the party that's out of power typically has a pretty good election cycle. So Democrats had a very good 2012. Senators run 6-year terms, and then a very good 2018. So you have a lot of senators who got elected in a very good year, Obama, and then in a rebound year, 2018, that are now up again in 2024 in states that have gotten a lot more conservative in those intervening 12 years. And whatever happens in terms of the presidential election, no one's expecting a blowout in either direction, so it's going to be pretty tight. So there's not going to be these significant coattails from the top of the ticket. So the odds that Democrats control the Senate are not zero, but if you ask any political handicapper, are quite low. And so that's, but if they do, then some corporate tax increase is absolutely on the table. It's just a question of, is it 25, 26, 27, somewhere in that neighborhood.
So let me dispense to one other tax head, tariffs, right? Because the Republicans have been making noise about pretty draconian tariff levels, right? So where's the thinking on that?
So if Trump wins, irrespective of what happens on the House and the Senate, although I think most observers would tell you if Trump wins, then there's very good odds that Republicans keep the House and take the Senate. So it would be full Republican control of House, Senate, and White House. In that scenario, but really this is just a function of the executive. So what most people don't realize, and even frankly I hadn't fully internalized until I started looking at it just a couple years ago, Congress over the last 100 years, so this is not a recent development, we're going back to like World War I, World War II era statutes, has delegated a lot of authority to the president, to the executive branch, to set tariff policy, such that it is not out of the question. This would be untested use of these authorities, so the courts will eventually probably have an opinion on this. But it is not out of the question that a president, any president, but Trump would be far more likely to do this than Harris, could impose economy-wide tariffs on all imports. Trump has talked about 10%. He's recently started talking about 10% on everything and everyone, 60% for China. Right? China gets singled out for derogatory treatment. That's a bipartisan, 60% is maybe not bipartisan, but signaling China out, at least in the US political system, is sort of bipartisan.
But at 60%, you get a lot of product dumping into Europe. Like that has knock-on
effects. It has knock-on effects. Well, there are a couple of things that are a little bit hard to predict. One is it 10, but he started talking about higher numbers, maybe 15 or 20. China, 60 or whatever. So there's kind of two pieces to be thinking about. One is this just an opening bid that yields a negotiation, that yields a lesser number, or some commitments to engage in more aggressive buying of U.S. agricultural products or whatever, which is there's some precedent for that. Failing that, what does the retaliation look like? It's be surprising and to some degree unprecedented for countries just to accept tariffs at this scale and not engage in some retaliatory tariff setting on their own. Right, and then as you pointed out, there are the knock-on effects of, okay, well, it's gotten expensive to sell into the U.S. market. Where else can I sell this product at more favorable terms? You think about Europe, you think about Australia, South America, right? There are places, right? There are other places where this product ends up going, and perhaps at depressed prices because you've got a market barrier coming into the U.S.
So that's a good whistle stop through everything, right? Just to close it all out, right? I'm just thinking parochially about Ireland, right? And I'm hearing pluses and minuses there. So bluntly, a higher corporation tax rate in the US helps us, right? And helps inward investment. China dumping product or the knock-on impact of tariffs is probably bad. We don't want to get caught up in any kind of a tariff war, right? We're a small open economy, right? So what's your sense? Where does this outlook look like for Ireland, or are we too early to call?
I mean, so much of it is dependent upon the White House, and the White House is no better than a coin toss 50-50 proposition, right? As the convention balance that Vice President Harris got, which wasn't huge to begin with, but it always subsides, and we're now seeing it subside, and we're starting to see more recent polling. What we are getting is the election that we thought we were going to have in January or February of this year, where it's going to come down to 10 or 15,000 voters in 5 or 6 states, kind of deciding the trajectory of the country. Then there was a period of time after the first debate where it looked like Republicans were ascendant because President Biden had just didn't have a good debate and ended up getting departing the ticket.
Didn't have a good debate is the polite way of saying
Is the polite way of saying yes. We're back to what we thought, which is that it's going to be a very close election, and we are very unlikely to know. It would be surprising anyway, to me, if we knew the answer to who won the White House on November 6th. I think it's going to take, it's going to be so close, recounts are not out of the question, even if they're not recounts, so close that the mail-in ballots that come in a couple days later will matter, right, in terms of like who won the critical votes, the critical states. It seems pretty clear, though, that Georgia is a state that's pretty important for Trump if he's got a path to getting the necessary votes, electoral votes to win. Pennsylvania is pretty important to Vice President Harris. Its nickname, setting aside politics, is the Keystone State. And it is in some ways the Keystone State.
It's certainly for her path to victory. It is.
Her path to victory, I mean, there are paths, but they are all much harder without Pennsylvania. If Trump wins Pennsylvania, then it's not automatic that he's president, but it puts him in a favorable position to get to the 270 electoral votes necessary to be elected president. The other thing that people should just be thinking about is you're going to see a lot of national polling data, but the U.S. doesn't run a national election. We run 51 different elections in 50 states plus the District of Columbia and the other territories. But the national polling does give you sort of a sense of the direction of travel. There is a bias in the Electoral College towards Republicans.
Yes.
Democrats end up, quote, wasting a lot of votes in cities like New York, San Francisco, right? California and New York are voting for Vice President Harris. No one's disputing that. Whether you win by 10 votes or 2 million votes, you get the same number of electoral votes as a result. So historically, what you have seen is if the Democrat is leading in the national polls, not historically, sort of recent vintage, by 1 or 2 points, that would suggest a Republican electoral victory, right? So if you're looking at the national polling data, which you will get more of than any other kind of data that's out there, keep looking at the margin. If the margin is 1 or 2, that is not great news for Democrats winning the Electoral College. Winning the popular vote gives you a moral victory, I suppose, but doesn't make you president of the United States. So you would be looking at that margin. If it starts to get to 3 or 4, then you start to think, okay, well, even if I haven't seen recent polling in a swing state, if the national polling is moving at this gap, it would suggest, it's circumstantial evidence anyway, that there's something happening in the swing states that will suggest an Electoral College victory. So something for viewers and listeners to be looking at, because you will get more national polling data than any kind of data. It has limited utility, but if you're looking at the direction of movement, it can start to give you a sense of where things are headed.
Perfect. My very final question. Both candidates agree on one policy, which I'm scratching my head at. No tax on tips. So as a final, do you think in January all the hospitality workers of America are going to be cheering?
Yes. So this is another example of campaigns are maybe not the ideal place to develop well thought out tax policy ideas, but it is very popular. And I was a little bit surprised. I talked to some colleagues, former colleagues on Capitol Hill right after former President Trump announced this in Nevada, and then, and they were like, this actually polls quite well, you'd be surprised. And then as evidence of that, Vice President Harris came in pretty quickly behind it and said, me too.
She has some caveats on it. It's not quite an open season.
It's not quite an open season, and even if Trump were president, Republicans ran the House and the Senate, it wouldn't be open season either. Otherwise, everyone would convert their income into tips, and there'd be a huge gaping hole in the tax base. But lawmakers who are thinking I might actually have to do something on this are starting to think about like what parameters could I put around it to limit the revenue loss, the gamesmanship. Is it these are just ideas I'm thinking of, like only a certain percentage of your income be declared tax-free tips, and the rest of it has to be taxable income, a dollar cap, an income threshold at who qualifies for it. One thing that's interesting that will be a challenge if one party is running the government and trying to use this reconciliation tool. So I said, one of the restrictions is you can't increase the budget deficit beyond the budget window, which is typically 10 years. One of the other restrictions, which typically isn't relevant, but would be perhaps here, is you cannot in budget reconciliation make changes to Social Security payroll taxes. So for workers who a lot of their income is tipped and is sort of tips, they probably don't have a lot of income tax liability because the U.S. has a very progressive income tax regime. But they will probably have a fair bit of payroll tax liability. There's not a ton that can be done in a budget reconciliation bill to relieve the payroll tax liability, because there is a specific 60 vote point of order to address that issue. So that's one that, I think lawmakers are trying to figure out how much benefit can we really provide, or to the extent that you're a lawmaker that isn't enthused about this idea, you throw up your hand and say, well, I would love to do more, but the rules say I can't, and so I'm sorry, we can do this limited thing and that's it.
Rohit, thank you very much for your time and for that whistle-stop tour. A lot can happen in 60 days. We know from the last 2 cycles, the last 60 days can throw up a lot of surprises. So we'll all wait very closely. Thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you the next time on the PwC Leadership Exchange.